Well, welcome everybody. My name is Chris Tremewan. I'm from the Association of Pacific Rim Universities, a political scientist. For those of you who don't know, we're an organization of research universities begun in 1997 by Caltech, Berkeley, USC, and UCLA, and brought together all the leading research universities in the APEC economies. We're now based in Hong Kong, and I think that's one of the reasons that I've been asked to chair this, because we have the 7 leading universities in China and the top 3 in Hong Kong as our members, and we are, of course, very much engaged not only on the research side, but also the policy side, and wondering, as things develop in China and its emergence as a global power in higher education and research, the way in which we negotiate our way and the relationships amongst universities. We have 2 very experienced specialists here today, and I will invite them one by one to give us their perspective on what is happening in China and the broader region and the implications perhaps for the global context of higher education. And we're going to have a roughly 10 minutes each, and then some questions. So we hope to have plenty of time for your questions from the floor on such an important topic. So I would like now to ask Mr. Paul Mooney to give his talk. Thank you so much.
Good morning. Several months ago, I started a collaboration with Scholars at Risk to write a lengthy report on higher education in China. I've been working on it for a few months. I have 2 colleagues in Beijing that are doing interviews. We've talked to about 70 people already. Doing research in China is always difficult. I'm a journalist by trade, but whether you're a journalist or an academic, it can be very difficult to do work in China because so many people are afraid to speak. And I think about 20 or 25% of the people we approached, some of them I thought would definitely talk with us, declined to speak with us. So that fear still exists, including there's one academic named Jiang Ming who wrote a book, Is China Education Sick?, which was he was quite outspoken in the book and very negative, critical. And I don't know if he was afraid to talk to us or if he got too much pressure after the book came out, but even he wouldn't talk to us. And another leading legal scholar who's been quite outspoken, on some of the questions we asked him, he said, I can't comment on that. But we're still able to talk to quite a few people and to gather enough information to have a proper description. I was based in Beijing for 18 years, and about 5 of those years I worked for a newspaper called the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is the main academic paper in the US. And so for 5 years I covered issues like this in China. And so when I started doing the research, basically bringing myself up to date on a lot of things, there's never been, since the communists came to power in 1949, there's never been real academic freedom in China. There've always been a lot of restrictions. And if you go back to the 50s and 60s and 70s when you had political campaigns, the 100 Flowers movement, the anti-rightist campaign, the Cultural Revolution, scholars and intellectuals were always bore the brunt of the attacks. In the 50s, during the 100 Flowers campaign, Mao asked scholars and intellectuals to say what they really thought about China, and they thought, oh, this is a new open period, and as soon as they spoke out, they were all attacked. So people in China, and then the Cultural Revolution, people were attacked, put in prison for various reasons, so people are reluctant to speak, even today, so many years after these things ended. There have been periods where things seem to be getting better. When I first went to China in the 80s, it was difficult to get any kind of scholar to accept an interview with a journalist. It got much better over the years, but right now, in the past 5 years, we've seen a real turn back. Since Xi Jinping became president in 2012, we've had unprecedented crackdown on the Chinese media, on the internet, social media, and on domestic media and foreign media, and also scholars. And this is, it's kind of unprecedented. If you go, maybe you go back to the Jiang Zemin days, that was actually a much better time. So recently at the party Congress, they managed to insert Xi Jinping political thought into the party constitution. Universities now are scrambling to set up Xi Jinping thought centers, research centers. They do it because they can get money for doing it. They also do it to show their loyalty to the party. Academics are being encouraged and given rewards for writing articles about Xi Jinping thought or communist ideology. And I just read that even if you did a video or an animation, you could get it would be the equivalent of writing an academic paper. And then the other thing is that also in schools now, up as low as the 5th and 6th grade, Xi Jinping thought has become a compulsory subject. So even young children have to study Xi Jinping thought. And it's not some deep thought from as far as I can see. It's a lot of just his sayings and dictums. There's not some strong philosophical or theory here. The universities are tightly controlled. If you're an academic, your activities, your writing, your lectures, all of this is being monitored. And there's a great deal of censorship. There's a lot of things you can't write about. Years ago, and I actually had this said to me a couple times, a scholar said to me, there's a line that's drawn, and we all know we can't step over the line. And sometimes people walk up to the line and they stub it with their toe, but they pull back. But nobody's, there's certain things you can't talk about, but there's some things that are in a gray area. And so scholars will, and a lot of public intellectuals, they draw a circle around themselves. And while the circle might only have to be this big, because of the uncertainty, they draw much bigger. And so the Communist Party doesn't even have to restrict certain things. People are going to self-censor themselves because they just don't know what they're going to get into trouble for. Doing research can get you into trouble. Even surveys can get you into trouble. Now, people say, well, it's really just on the humanities that there's this problem. But even in the sciences, you can get into problems. If it's something about AIDS, you're probably not going to be able to write about it. Certain environmental issues are a no-no. I was told by a scholar that his colleague had written an academic paper on some environmental issue and nothing to do with politics, but he had a chemical term. This chemical was being produced factories were being opened up in rural areas to produce this chemical. Local villagers were against it. They were protesting. And because of this, in an academic paper about a chemical product, you couldn't mention the abbreviation for the chemical. So it can be quite absurd at times. And there are a lot of restrictions that keep people in line. If you don't follow the party line, if you are a little bit too outspoken, you won't get a promotion, right? If you won't get research funds, and Chinese scholars, a lot of their income comes from research funds. You won't be able to go on an academic exchange. You won't be able to go abroad. Some scholars get basically. There's a new phrase in China to be disappeared. Okay, which means that, well, you didn't disappear, somebody disappeared you. And, for example, Tong Biao, a well-known human rights lawyer and academic, people in plain clothes picked him up in the garage of his building, threw a black sack over his head, threw him in the back of a car, and then drove him out to wasn't even in a prison, and for 60 days he was held incommunicado. And I believe that he was a lot of, at that time, this is 2011, quite a few lawyers were kidnapped in that way, and some were brutally tortured. So so these are the things that you have to face. Chao Mu is a journalism professor at Beijing Foreign Studies University, and he was also quite outspoken. And he said, what he said, in a journalism class, you can't talk about journalism. In a political science class, you can't talk about politics. He was outspoken, so what they did was they sent him to the library to work. And his job was to write book reviews and to translate things. And his income went from 300,000 renminbi to 200,000 renminbi, plus he lost about 200,000 renminbi in research funds that he would have had. So with his career ruined, also, he'd been at the university 10 years. Normally, after 5 years, he would have gotten a promotion. He didn't get that promotion. And he said that he always wanted to, that he was determined to stay in China and to fight for a better system. But when he saw that he couldn't do anything and how limited he was, and he was having trouble supporting his family, he went to the U.S. last year. Well, and even now, he still has problems surviving and kind of covering himself. There was another scholar, this goes back a few years ago, named Zhao Guobiao, who also taught journalism and had written an open letter criticizing the propaganda department. And I don't think he actually wanted it to be disseminated, but somebody did that, went online, and he was, same thing, he was taken from the journalism department and was sent to work in the library. They took all his classes away from him, the same as Chao Mu, no classes. And then, because they didn't want them to have contact with the students. And then he was offered a National Endowment for Democracy Fellowship in the U.S., so since he had no classes and no work, he went to the U.S. When he came back, the university fired him for being absent without leave, which was just an excuse. If they want to get rid of you, they'll find an excuse like that. It can be quite bad. Teng Biao, the lawyer that I mentioned, he managed to get to the U.S. and he did a fellowship, I believe, at Harvard and then NYU, and I think he's now at Princeton. I'm not 100% sure about that. But he came with his young daughter, but they wouldn't let his wife and other daughter come out of China. So he had to actually have them smuggled out of China through Southeast Asia, I believe, maybe from Burma into Thailand, and then from Thailand they were able to come to the United States. So can you imagine in this day and age that people have to risk their lives, and it's going through like jungle, you're dealing with different kind of, criminal elements who are helping you to get cross borders and to get into other countries. And I was looking at the Wall Memorial last week, and I was very moved to see the photos of people that had died trying to escape. And, of course, Chinese scholars and public intellectuals, people like this, they're not risking their lives, but they are risking getting arrested, being put in jail, and possibly being hurt. One very prominent lawyer, his wife, young son, about 6 years old, and daughter escaped. And I think it took them months to get to Thailand. And at one point, the son got separated from the mother and the other daughter because they thought police were around. And she didn't see her son for a few more days. And she told me, I thought I was never going to see my son again. And 3 or 4 days later, she got to a safe house near the Thai border, and there was her son. So people, it's just hard for me to believe that in 2018, people are risking their lives in order to leave a country. It shouldn't be that way. Foreign scholars in China also face a lot of problems. It's getting increasingly difficult to get a visa. If you're a Tibet scholar or a Xinjiang scholar, almost impossible to get a visa. I know about 13 Xinjiang scholars who have not been allowed regularly, only every couple of years, and when they go in, they're not allowed to go to Xinjiang. And one prominent scholar of Xinjiang told me, if you're a reporter, if you have to leave China, you can go to Paris or London, but I spent my whole career studying Xinjiang, and if I can't do Xinjiang, and if I can't even go there, then I don't have a career. And the last time I talked to him, he said that he'd switched to the Silk Road. So he's completely giving up doing research. Another scholar I talked to in Hong Kong, who is American, was doing research for years in Sichuan province, and then went in about 2 years ago. He was working on something, and he hadn't finished the research yet, and then the local authorities came to him and said, you have to leave. And he said, but I got permission, I did it's very complicated, I got the various approvals, but they still made him leave. And he said that he's quite discouraged now. Just to conclude, so I asked, what are people doing if they're trying to study some of these issues? They're using archives. They don't even leave China. You can write your PhD sitting in New York or Berlin, but what they said is they don't even know if our archives, which are China-based, are actually accurate or not. And one scholar compared actual magazines with scholars and found about 15 to 80% of the material was missing. So the whole field of China studies has been changed because of this. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks for the invitation to speak here. My name is Eva Pills. I am at King's College London. I'm a legal scholar working on human rights in China. Some time ago, I rejected an application from a student from China who wanted to do a doctoral thesis with me on a human rights topic, one of the topics I very much care about. I would have loved to supervise that student. I rejected her because I felt that she had absolutely no idea what she was letting herself in for. She had applied for government funding, which of course she might well not have got, given the topic she had chosen. But also, she, even assuming that she would somehow have been able to come and study with us in London, I felt that she didn't realize, I couldn't make her realize that with that topic, proposing to do fieldwork in China as a student from China, a Chinese national, she might face a lifetime of problems with her research, of monitoring, of censorship, of self-censorship, of the kinds of things that Paul was just talking about, that of course include not only pressure on yourself as a scholar, but also on your colleagues, your teachers, your family even. So, giving it some consideration, I decided that this wasn't going to work because I couldn't be confident that this particular applicant knew what she might be facing, and I felt it wasn't ethically okay for me to accept her. But of course, I also felt really, really bad because in some ways I was accepting the fact of censorship and you might say becoming reluctantly complicit with the censorship and self-censorship that affects us, and that this is going to be my point in just a few minutes. In the few minutes I have, I think China poses a threat, along with other authoritarian countries, a threat to global academic freedom that is very complicated. So much of that threat, of course, comes because there is a lot of money that allows China to take influence, the Chinese government, I should say, to take influence on academic research, not only in China, but also transnationally. But then, of course, also there are decisions that we make as scholars outside that I think can contribute to the problem. So just to try and outline very briefly what in the ways in which there's a kind of authoritarian influencing on scholarship, on global scholarship. Let me give a few examples. There is first, I think, what Paul was talking about, what perhaps you could call a kind of transnational repression, the fact that some scholars who would be fantastic speakers at international conferences will not be allowed out, the travel bans, but also that those who are allowed out will be under a lot of monitoring. They may have to report what sort of talks they want to give. They have to get approval for titles, sometimes abstracts, and report afterwards on who participated and what was said. They may experience intimidation, for example, of their relatives at home, in order to put them under pressure. And of course, also, as Paul mentioned, in the other direction, scholars on topics like human rights in China, my topic, are constantly having to think about the possibility that they might be banned and some are denied access, if not to the country, then at least to certain sources of information, or indeed, as I have very often experienced, to particular people, because they are currently detained, disappeared, under house arrest, or simply instructed not to speak to somebody who wants to discuss sensitive topics. So that's repression. It's very much centered, it sort of comes from the Chinese government and similar governments, I think, around the world. But there's, of course, also a lot of consensual, collaborative relationships, especially where there is money, there is financial support for academic research. And those relations can be highly problematic. To give perhaps just one example that you may have come across, Cambridge University Press some months ago, as it turned out some months ago, had agreed to censor the online database of academic journals it was making available in China, to censor the Chinese version at the request of the Chinese government. And they did that just like that because it was a commercial venture, essentially. Cambridge University Press, after that act of self-censorship was disclosed, actually decided not to censor after all, in reaction to an outcry, a public appeal to boycott CUP over this. But there are other publishers, such as Springer, which is an academic publisher here in Germany, that just simply continue to engage in censorship direct censorship at the request of the Chinese government. There is so much academic collaboration that takes the form of exchange programs, that takes the form of joint conferences, but also, of course, campuses of foreign universities in China, but also sort of setting up business in China, but also things like the Peking University campus that has just recently been opened in Oxford. Now, there is a lot that is great and important about academic exchange, but very often those exchanges come either with direct strings attached, like the CUP example, or there is self-censorship or a kind of nudging, a kind of informal guidance given to, let's say, the organizers of a conference that decide that certain topics have to be, cannot be discussed. I have had sort of experience of this, of course, for example, instructions that the word human rights needs to be taken out of the title of a conference panel. And then there is, I think, thirdly, this problem of reluctant complicity. That was sort of my own experience. And I think that that is so often sort of understandable, I do feel, when we censor ourselves in order, for example, to protect academic partners. An example of that, just quickly, would be the decision by the American Bar Association to withdraw its offer of publication of a book written by Dr. Teng Biao, whom Paul mentioned a few minutes earlier, the scholar who decided not to return to China and whose family had to flee illegally, had to get out illegally in order to sort of escape repression due to his activities. The American Bar Association has a rule of law project. It's called the Rule of Law Initiative, and it's got an office in China. It decided that it couldn't, after all, publish Dr. Chong Biao's, the legal human rights scholar's book, in order to protect its program in China about the rule of law. Very complicated, very, very problematic. So I think that it is not just that we need to continue focusing and caring about scholars who are intensely persecuted and sort of supporting people in these individual cases. That remains very important, of course, but I think especially with economically, geopolitically very powerful countries like China and its academic programs, which are entirely projects of the party state, we need to rethink the terms of engagement, of our engagement with China, sort of as academics. And I think that we need to very much question what used to be, I think, a very confident, paradigmatic, you might say, belief that exchange and collaboration would help institutions in still authoritarian countries to become sort of more liberal and liberated. We need to, I think, insist on more sort of a more careful approach to exchange and collaboration that will require, I think, transparency above all. On what terms are Confucius Institutes, for example, opened, or Chinese campuses opened in our countries. It will require, I think, investment screening, proper screening of donations and funding we accept as institutions. And also, I think we have to, in some ways, start thinking about our status as sort of half complicit, sort of complicity and victimhood, if you like, and think about how we can resist those pressures in a more systematic way. I think that one of the things that we might need to do is to articulate the principles of academic freedom that, as they need to be upheld in the specific context of international and transnational academic exchange. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank our two panelists for giving us a sense of the environment in China. And I think, you know, a couple of points I'd like to make while you think of your questions. One is to map the environment a little more and to say that obviously China in the last decades has achieved an enormous amount in building up university, higher education to a level that was never there before. And as has been mentioned, there is a lot of money to be had in that system. And our universities in many countries are reliant on fee-paying international students, many of whom come from China. And if you go to any major event of a major university in China, you will find the presidents and rectors and vice-chancellors of all the main universities in the world. So that is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is the environment that is new and that we have to, as Eva has said, somehow think through the terms of engagement in this new era. We also face the fact that events in the US with the Trump administration and with Brexit have provided quite an alibi for those who would say that social democracy has its limits. And so that's something else that on our side of the fence, if you like, we have to take into account. And one of the other things that comes out of the presentations this morning is the need to articulate the principles of academic freedom. How do we have that discussion on academic values? None of us on this panel are from the region. How do we have those discussions led by those from the region? So I think that's a very serious challenge to those of us who care about academic values. And we have to acknowledge that people are proud to build their own countries, and to a degree of eminence in academia. The question is how we get there, and of course it should not be at the price of individuals' freedom and academic freedom. So let me open the floor, having scoped that fairly wide environment and not mentioned Hong Kong at all, which we were saying might be the canary in some sense, for what could happen. It was mentioned that before Xi Jinping, the previous administrations in China, there was a more open, more flexible. Are we facing just a temporary phenomenon for a strongman administration? If so, how do we get through that period and still build positive relations with our colleagues? So let me open the floor. Who would like to be the first, please?
So I'm going to make two comments.
Can I give you this?
With regard to the history of censorship in China, as Paul was alluding to, the history of Western countries acceding to censorship for their own purposes also has a long past. So particularly in the United States, in North America, post-Tiananmen Square, issues of self-interest and maintaining nascent relationships and relationship building with Chinese institutions was also there. So complicity on the part of the West has a long history, as well as censorship. So I think the change really is China becoming a global power. And in that regard, the pressure for becoming or achieving world university status is quite severe, both in Hong Kong and in China. And at least in Hong Kong, there is a recognition that academic freedom has some role to play with regard to one's world-class status. And I guess I would argue that to the extent that academics in China are also being judged by the degree to which their research is internationally recognized, that there is some possibility for a break with regard to the censorship, domestic censorship that's occurring, because those two goals are at odds with one another. So maybe you might want to comment upon that. Okay.
Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I very much agree with what you say about complicity and its long history, and the fact that somehow this problem has become much bigger so far as China is concerned because of China's rise. I think that it's a very good point to make that academic institutions in China are trying to achieve global excellence. Indeed, a lot of effort is put into climbing these university rankings that we all love. And one of the things that facilitates that rise in the rankings of institutions like Tsinghua University, Peking University, and so on, is the fact that, so far as I can see, there are no explicit criteria regarding academic freedom in those rankings. I think that if that changed, we would perhaps be able to correct the image and also to sort of leverage to get the kind of leverage that you were talking about.
Can I ask, in terms of the idea that scholars build relationships of trust across national boundaries regardless of the agendas of their nation states, which is what happened in Europe during many conflicts, is there an argument there for that in China? Maintaining relationships despite the agendas of various governments.
Well, I think that
relationships of trust and cooperation.
I think that, of course, it is important to maintain relationships between academic, sort of individual academics and regarding sort of good, proper research projects, I think that in our situation today, we really have no shortage of that, and also people working on China, will want to keep those relations.
I was just reflecting on your use of the word complicity, but that's not what you mean by complicity.
Well, what I mean by complicity is the fact that when we engage in ways that facilitate or just involve censorship of others or self-censorship, we become complicit.
That's right, okay.
I agree, of course, this reminds me a little bit of the discussion today at the plenary, that we have to make difficult decisions, and that just like academics in China, I think the reasons that there can be good reasons for even self-censorship to protect others. That's a terrible situation, but I think we can probably understand how that decision is made.
I'm sorry, yes, please. There's a microphone. Right.
One of the things is that they're coming under critique as being basically propaganda tools and so forth and so on. And to me, it'll be very interesting to see how the government reacts to that, whether there's any attempt to mitigate that critique with any possible reform or not. But clearly, I think that kind of exposure, I don't know if other people here have had that experience with the Confucius Institute. That's one thing. My other question, thank you, has to do with turning the topic here today around. What fields are possible? In other words, what fields do the Chinese authorities not care about, which possibly create a space for some is it the humanities, for example? Some areas of the humanities? I would think that they favor certain kinds of economic research that serve the government, but leaving that aside, could you talk, for example, about possibilities in the humanities? Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Confucius Institutes and humanities.
Right. In terms of the Confucius Institute, there's a bit of a debate about this. I'm sorry. In terms of the Confucius Institute, there's a bit of a debate. Is my speaker on? Is this on? Hello? Can you hear me? Speak a little bit closer. Okay. Is this working?
Turn it on now. I think you turn it on.
Okay, is this better?
Yep.
Right, okay. There's a bit of a debate about the Confucius Institutes. I've spoken to a lot of scholars. Some of them will say, oh, they're horrible. You know, it's, the Chinese are coming in and they're dictating, what can be, what can be taught, who can come to lecture at the university. And other scholars said, oh, we have one, we've never had a problem. But I think that the people that think there's no problem are a bit naive. I was just actually looking yesterday in about the things. I don't know who the person was, but a senior Chinese official said, the practical mission, and this was about the Confucius Institutes, the practical mission of promoting the real political influence of the PRC. Okay, so he was saying the Confucius Institutes are to promote the interests of the PRC. Li Changchun, who was on the standing committee at the time, this is several years, 2011, said, using the excuse of teaching the Chinese language, everything looks reasonable and logical. And a few months ago, an Australian scholar gave me a copy of some memos from the Chinese government in which they actually said, we want to use the Confucius Institute to spread our, to kind of just propagate our narrative. Quite a few of the institutes, I shouldn't say quite a few, a handful of have shut down in the US and Europe and Canada in recent years, so people are a bit skeptical about it. I also found that in some universities where they set up, I was talking to one of the leading China scholars at Columbia University, and I asked him about the Confucius Institute, he goes, I have no idea. The university never talked to him about it. And I found this in a lot of cases. It'll be the administration, and so they don't look at the fine line. They're not thinking about the political implications when they agree to open up one of these institutes. But University of Chicago shut its a few years ago, and there was one university in Texas about 2 or 3 weeks that shut down. Austin, yeah. And then there was a university in Canada that shut theirs down. So there's a kind of a growing skepticism about the institutes.
And part of the skepticism, I think, is also about the discrimination of staff who are hired from China, but who, for example, are subject to sort of political probity tests. That means that nobody who's from the spiritual group Falun Gong, which is persecuted, will be admitted as a teacher, will be hired as a teacher in those institutes. I think very quickly on the question about the humanities, if I may, I think that the humanities are in some ways, as an area, particularly in many ways very problematic because they're so close to politics. So much of the enforced sort of, forced study of party sort of doctrine and censorship and self-censorship, of course, takes place in these areas of academic research, writing, and teaching. However, I think that, thanks for the question. I think that one thing that I would say in response to sort of what can we do, what can we still do, where can we still engage, I think it's not so much perhaps about particular areas, because all areas are somehow affected, but I think we need to insist keeping open lines of communication with scholars who are outspoken and who, to varying degrees, resist all this control and censorship. And that, of course, is difficult. And one way to ensure that we don't sort of forego the opportunity of keeping that communication open, I think, is not letting the sort of Chinese partner institution decide, who comes to a conference, sort of decide about the topics, to sort of be aware of the fact that we need to keep communicating with dissident sort of scholars. And I think that that's why, that's one of the ways in which we can continue engaging in a meaningful way and in a helpful way.
I think also, just to add to that, a number of countries have been, in East Asia, Southeast Asia, have been saying that they want student graduates that are more innovative and critical thinking and the starting liberal arts programs. Now that seems, in some settings, quite a contradiction. And how that works out, I don't know, but it may be another opportunity, as you were saying, for engagement. Can I have the next speaker question?
Well, thank you very much for the presentations. I want to comment on the question of why is it that we don't have Chinese people speak about the issue and we speak in their absence, which precisely this is, a testimony to the fact that they can't be here and that we as a scholarly community have an obligation to carry their voices. I think it's completely out of the question for a Chinese academic, even an outspoken one, to travel to Berlin to a conference on this topic, which is partly funded by an organization such as OSF and NED is also part of the network. That's just impossible. So we are stuck in a situation where we need interpreters that travel between the two worlds and help us understand the debate in China. And Eva and Paul are two of such interpreters. When I listen to your story about the PhD student, it may be a little bit crazy, but this is the kind of thoughts that we have these days. Is I was wondering whether this might also be a spy. Who is coming from China to do a PhD with you? If I wanted to understand what Eva Pilz is up to, this would be a fabulous way to do it. And I think this is really very complicated because we want to build relationships with scholars, but at the same time we always have a second thought about who they might be and what their agenda is. And to manage that is very, very difficult. And I think we need to talk more about how we deal with that situation. That said, I want to put a little bit of sand maybe into the narrative. I think by giving examples primarily of human rights scholars and journalists, you've picked up on two very sort of sensitive fields of study. I'd like, in terms of mapping the field, understand better how repressive academics feel universities are in China when they work on, chemistry and math. And I feel freedom to teach should include no obligation to teach, for example, Xi Jinping thought. And I would argue that all scholars are affected by the need to show loyalty, and therefore they become part of a repressive apparatus.
If I might, I simply agree on the last point. The sort of having to participate in all this in the political education. I think it serves also sort of it kind of breaks your ability to become an advocate, for example, for any sort of improvement in your field, in your area. And in that sense, all scholars, I think, are affected. I think that on the paranoid question of sort of how to engage with scholars who might in some ways be recruited to spy on us, there is, of course, the institution of the Association for Scholars, for Chinese scholars and students abroad. Basically, everyone who comes to sort of goes abroad is a member, and it is a mechanism that I think is well understood for some monitoring of what goes on, for example, in our classrooms by the various Chinese embassies via students. The reason I mention this is because I think that one has to accept that in a repressive environment, vulnerable scholars, especially junior ones, well, at all levels, I suppose, can simply be recruited because it's very difficult to reject a request to provide information. Sort of from that perspective, my view is that one should engage regardless, and I just assume, for example, when teaching law and society in Western classrooms, that there might be some reporting going on.
Cheng Biao, who Olga and I both mentioned, I spoke to him when he was at Harvard, and he said he started holding weekly salons in his apartment where fellow Chinese scholars and some of the grad students would come and they would discuss things. And he told me that if there was one person there that the others weren't familiar with, none of them would talk. They would just sit there and listen. They were afraid of getting into trouble. And another friend of mine who's teaching Chinese politics said that her students spy on her, that reports were sent back to China. Andy Nathan at Columbia told me that a grad student walked up to him once and said, I write reports on you back to China, but I tell them that you're a pretty good guy. You're a solid scholar. You're not against China. So you have these things. A Chinese grad student, said that he went back. He went back and was immediately called by the Public Security Bureau to, they say, to have tea, which means a discussion, and they knew everything he'd done and spoken about. And then he realized that it was another grad student that he met at his university that he befriended and trusted, and they spent a lot of time together. But by the things that the police back in China knew, he knew it was this one student. And some of the stuff was exaggerated, what he had never said, So China, a very popular thing in the last 5 or 6 years is to write articles called The Long Arm of China, because they reach into other countries and they do interfere in a lot of things, including academia. And just one final thing is one friend of mine, she said, she said, if you want to be engaged in human rights, as a Chinese scholar abroad, you basically have to be cold-hearted, because you have to break all your relations with your family. She's afraid to even call home. And it's because she doesn't want her parents to be harassed. It's very common for police in China to go to the homes of Chinese, to the mother and the father and the sister and brother in China, and basically try to intimidate them there. So you become a hostage to the Chinese system.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Let me join in the thanks to all of you. Are we as scholars doing enough? Are we as scholars doing enough to connect with journalists and with artists who may be dissident artists or artists in exile, but is there enough cross-conversation and cross-activity among scholars, journalists, and Chinese artists, either dissidents in China or in exile out of China? Are there opportunities for collaborations that we are not cultivating?
Thank you. I think that so far as scholars who are already in exile are concerned, I think that they do try to build up good networks, and that includes the artists, the documentary filmmakers, the journalists who have left and can't come back. I think that what I would see as a huge problem is that these sort of our engagement with these communities, as you hinted, is too weak. I think that the problem of academic repression in China is basically seen as more as a kind of a problem for experts to be studied, but not really for us to sort of engage on. I don't know, Paul, do you have, from a journalist perspective, anything to add?
No, I feel that sometimes we are complicit in these things, you know. So, for example, when Teng Biao and Chen Guangtong they had scheduled a discussion at Harvard University, and a few days before, and it was approved, and they had a space, and a few days before the discussion, at the law school said, please, we'd rather you don't hold this. And the reason given was that the head of the law school was going to meet Xi Jinping, and they didn't want to embarrass him. You know, Perry Link at Princeton told me there were at least 2 professors at Princeton who were not allowed to go back to China, and the president of Princeton went to China several times and never once brought up their case, but complained that the U.S. government wasn't moving fast enough to give visas to Chinese students and academics. So even our universities aren't, you know, and Teng Biao said to me, I knew in China that we were intimidated, and, you know, but I didn't think this would happen in America. And certainly this is not China saying to Harvard, he can't speak here. It's what I talked about before. It's this self-censorship where Harvard's saying, oh, this might cause problems. Or like with the Bar Association, this might cause problems for our program. So people are self-censoring and being complicit with China just based on their own kind of fears.
About connections with artists and people outside of academia. So I thank you.
Is there a final question? Otherwise, yes, please. Elizabeth.
I just wanted to ask about the human rights. When we had a workshop on human rights in Stockholm at the Academy, we also had a Chinese there. He came, and we had quite heated debate because he definitely had different opinion and different views of what human rights actually were. So not only did he come, I mean, we were at the Swedish Academy, this fantastic room, but he was really angry, of course, that the majority didn't agree with him, that the sort of human rights were something sort of a Western idea. No. So it wasn't something that was valid for everybody, and we should also be able to discuss it. So is that something that you have in your research then?
Absolutely, yes. So my work is on human rights in China, and I think that in recent months, the Chinese government and academics dependent on the government, sort of working for the government, have really accelerated their efforts to try and sort of redefine human rights also at an international level. So, for example, last November, at the end of a very large conference called a South-South Dialogue in Beijing, a so-called Beijing Declaration on Human Rights was issued in Beijing, purporting to be the result of this sort of this large conference, and it basically, when you look at this document, it sort of takes human rights advocacy, it takes freedom of speech, it takes all political rights out of the concept of human rights. That's my reading of it anyway. And it really turns human rights into a kind of lofty goal to be achieved collaboratively by governments, not society, not advocates, lawyers, scholars, artists. And I think that that is now also being taken, for instance, to the UN level with this recent so-called resolution on win-win collaboration on human rights that was initiated by China and passed with, I think, only one vote against at the Human Rights Council. So it's not just having discussions, which of course is always a good idea, about human rights imperialism and such theories at the scholarly level, but also I think it's important to see how those scholarly voices really support what is currently also a major sort of government policy.
You know, this line that human rights is some foreign concept for the Chinese, it's the old party line. I've been hearing it for decades. But, you know, human rights is a universal. It's not a Western concept. And if they arrest your father and put him in jail and torture him, it doesn't hurt less if he's Chinese than if he's American or German, you know. The pain is still there. But it's a convenient kind of catchphrase or thing to say, and a lot of people don't think about it. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. And the other thing I would say, I actually stopped talking about human rights. What I talk about now is the Constitution, because a lot of these basic rights, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, they're in the Chinese Constitution. So we're not asking them to do something that's a foreign concept or something completely foreign. They drew up their own Constitution, and there are basic guarantees that they just completely ignore. So I would say I'd just be happy if they guaranteed Chinese people their own constitutional rights, but they don't.
Well, thank you very much. This has been very stimulating. In terms of the next generation, do you see any changes? Because the young people seem quite different from or am I being a little naive? And I know, for example, last week, the women students at Peking University have been quite active in resisting harassment and pointing out, is that just a narrow set of complaints against misbehavior in an institutional sense, or could it be a broader movement for change?
I think you're mentioning that you're alluding to the fact that Me Too has reached China as well, and there is a Me Too movement. Absolutely, I think that's a great sign, I think, of the attractiveness of the universal attractiveness of human rights that Paul was also just referring to. I think that young people, on the one hand, they really do have a lot more access to the global discussions, like, for example, Twitter and so on, although, of course, many social media are censored in China, there are also ways of getting around that, and young people are great at just that. There is more opportunity, I would personally say, also from my experience of interacting with Chinese students in the classroom, and in many ways, I think there are more opportunities also to learn about their own country's past, and that, of course, can be a great sort of reason to engage and think about one's political future. But I also would say that there has been a significant shift under Xi Jinping towards more stringent monitoring and political education. And the monitoring, of course, doesn't only affect young people or young students. Just to give one example, the Chinese government has started rolling out a program called the social credit system. It works a little bit like a sort of credit, like a credit check, except that what is being checked and monitored and recorded is really your overall sort of credibility, probity, acceptability as a Chinese citizen, and that, of course, includes many political criteria. And if you are not behaving, if you're sort of expressing dissident views, you may find, for example, that you can no longer obtain a passport, or that your children have restrictions in terms of their access to state schools. So that, of course, is sort of the dark side. And
Social
I think
conformity,
we must
yes.
stay aware of that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I have mixed feelings about this. I'd like to think that with the internet, that young Chinese people have more access, although they have to jump over, they need a VPN to get over the firewall. I'd like to think that they're more open-minded, they know more, but there's a lot of evidence that goes against that. When UC San Diego invited the Dalai Lama to speak at the graduation last year, Chinese students were up in arms, and they protested, they criticized the movement. Oh, they see the Dalai Lama has, a lot of the Chinese students have grown up, they've been brainwashed to a certain degree. And so they've been taught that the Dalai Lama is an evil, separatist, independence activist, and it hurt their feelings that the university would invite this guy to speak at their graduation. But they're not educated, they don't know about the Dalai Lama. And some people have said it was the Chinese government or the Chinese Scholars and Students Association that pushed this line, but they don't even need it. There are a lot of young students that are quite nationalistic that will get angry about these things, on their own. A friend of mine who teaches on the 1989 student crackdown, her small college had 10 Chinese students. They all attacked her. They went online. They attacked her. They went to the university and attacked her and said, "Oh, she's teaching lies. This never happened." Of course the crackdown happened. There were photographs, videos, and things. The university told her, "Oh, maybe you should try to be more considerate of their feelings." But they were just ignorant about that. And then just one other thing is that one of the professors I spoke to recently said that 10 years ago, his students, he could talk about problems in society and within the government, and his students were very receptive. He said now they go and report him to the authorities. This is in Beijing. And he said they have a new term now for them, which is, I think it's called cell phone home, little pink, because they're not fully red, communist red, but they're not as open as students were maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years ago.
Well, Mr. Paul Mooney and Dr. Eva Pilz, thank you so much for your contribution to this panel. Thank you.